I found my stepfather's notebook after his death, and in it was a confession that my girlfriend had been cheating on me with him for 6 months, starting from that night when I left for Europe on exchange. I learned about this 6 months after everything had already happened, and the worst part was that at the moment when it all began, I wasn't even there. I was leaving for Europe on a student exchange, and I remember that day too well because back then it seemed like just an important stage in life, a temporary separation that we would get through because we talked about it, made plans, promised each other we would manage, and I left with the confidence that I had a home, had a relationship, had people I trusted, and it was during that period, as I now understand, that everything began. Because in the notebook there was a date, the evening of my departure, and it was written that they crossed the line right then, after I left, and this knowledge later destroyed every memory of that day. I wasn't looking for this truth. I was just sorting through his things after his death because it needed to be done. And when I found that notebook, I opened it without any ulterior motive, simply because I thought there might be something important there. But the first pages were ordinary, and I almost closed it until I saw dates matching the time when I was abroad. And something inside me tensed because it was that very period that I always remembered as strange, as if something had gone wrong, but I couldn't understand what exactly. At first I thought the problem was just the distance, because cracks started appearing between us. But to be honest, the first changes I noticed weren't in her, but in him. And back then, they seemed like small things, insignificant details that were easy to explain. But now, rereading these notes, I understand they were the first signals that I simply ignored. He had always been a calm, steady, even somewhat detached person, but he always kept in touch with me, asked how I was doing, showed interest in my studies, sometimes would write just because, and before my departure this was normal, even warm in its own way. But a couple of weeks before I left, he started behaving differently, and I noticed it then, but didn't give it any weight because I didn't see anything dangerous in it. For example, he stopped maintaining conversations that he himself used to start. If I wrote to him, he would reply briefly, sometimes with delays, sometimes ignoring me altogether, though that had never happened before. He started avoiding direct eye contact when we crossed paths, became somehow nervous, but not so much that it was obvious. Rather, on a feeling level, as if he was constantly thinking about something and didn't want it to show, and I attributed it to stress, to his business, to fatigue, because there was no reason to think otherwise. I also remember the moment a few days before my departure when we were all together, and he unexpectedly left the room when I entered, though that had never happened before, and it was strange, but not enough for me to start asking questions, because I didn't have even one scenario in my head where this could mean something serious. And then I left, and already there, in Europe, the changes started happening with her, but they were gradual, not sharp, and so again, I didn't see anything in it besides ordinary long-distance problems. At first, it was small things. She started replying later than usual, sometimes skipped my messages, then started initiating conversations less frequently. If before she could write first, ask how my day was, share something of her own, now that almost disappeared, and I tried to compensate, wrote more, tried to maintain contact, thought that I was the one who had to hold everything together. Then her tone changed. It's hard to explain, but it became colder, as if distance appeared between us, not just physical, but internal. She could reply shortly, without emotion, without interest, sometimes completely avoiding conversations that used to be important to us. And if I tried to talk about the future, about when we would see each other, she would either change the subject or reply in a way that left me with the feeling that it wasn't so important to her anymore. There was a specific moment that I remembered then, but didn't understand. About a month after my departure, I called her in the evening, and she said she couldn't talk long because she was busy, and there was tension in her voice, as if she didn't want me to hear what was happening around her. and the conversation ended too quickly. And after that, she didn't call back, though she always used to try to compensate for such things. And then I felt something unpleasant, but again, convinced myself it was just circumstances. Now, reading this notebook, I see that it was during this time that everything was already happening, that it wasn't a coincidence, wasn't a period when we simply drifted apart. It was the moment when they had already crossed that line that you can't cross by accident, and everything that happened after was a consequence of that. The hardest blow came when I reached the entry with the date of my departure, where he directly wrote that everything began that evening when I was no longer nearby, and that he understood what he was doing and understood who he was betraying. And this destroyed everything in me, because that day for me had been the beginning of something new, but turned out to be the beginning of the end of what I considered most important. I sat with this notebook and understood that back then I hadn't noticed anything, that I had left with the confidence that I had a relationship that was simply going through a difficult stage. But in fact, at that moment, everything was already destroyed. I just didn't know about it. And now, when all these details fell into one picture, I understood that there was no way back. Because this wasn't just infidelity. It was a chain of events in which I was the only one who didn't know the truth. And it was this that made everything finally impossible to return to the previous life. For a long time, I couldn't make myself read further, because even what I had already learned was more than I could process. But at some point, something inside seemed to switch, and it became important to me not just to know the fact, but to understand how exactly this happened, how this became possible at all. And I returned to the notebook, to those pages where he described in detail that very day. And it was there that everything finally stopped, being something abstract, and became concrete, clear, real. He wrote that everything began with an ordinary situation that didn't raise his suspicions. He was just giving her a ride because it was logical, because I had already left, because she asked, because they knew each other. And there was nothing strange in this. And I, reading this, understood that I myself would never have seen a threat in this, because it looked normal, like help, like ordinary interaction that shouldn't have led to what happened next. He described how they stopped at a supermarket parking lot, simply because the conversation dragged on, because they didn't want to cut it off mid-sentence. And he wrote that she looked depressed, that she talked about me, said she missed me, that it was hard for her because of the distance, that she wasn't coping with this state. And this was what finally destroyed me, because I read this and understood that at that moment she was talking about how hard it was without me, to the person with whom she would eventually cheat on me. And this feeling of contradiction was so strong that my head literally started spinning. He wrote that the conversation became too personal, that they started discussing not just me, but her feelings in general, her doubts, her inner state, and he admitted that at some point he felt that closeness appearing between them that went beyond normal, and that it was then that he should have stopped, but didn't. And this repeated again and again, as if he was trying to capture that moment where it was still possible to stop everything, but he missed it. Further, he wrote that he himself suggested having a drink, that this was a way to diffuse the situation, make the conversation less tense, and they just sat in the car, drinking beer and continuing to talk. And in these lines, there was a sense that everything happened gradually, without a sharp transition, as if boundaries were erasing themselves, without an explicit decision to cross them. The moment of the affair itself he described without details, but clearly enough to leave no doubts. He wrote that it happened in the car, that it wasn't planned, that everything happened as if by itself, and it was this word, by itself, that repeated several times, like an attempt to remove responsibility from himself. But at the same time, further on, he wrote that he understood what he was doing. And this contradiction hit the hardest, because you can't simultaneously not control a situation and be aware of it. After this, according to his words, there immediately came a feeling of wrongness. He wrote that at that very moment he understood that something had happened that couldn't be fixed, that he felt guilt, that it was hard for him even to think about this, and that she also looked confused. And they almost immediately started talking about how this was a mistake, that this shouldn't have happened, that this needed to be forgotten. He wrote that they agreed to pretend that nothing had happened, that it was one time, that it would stay between them, and that they would simply return to normal life. And in these lines, there was something especially heavy, because it sounded like an attempt to erase reality, as if you could simply decide that this hadn't happened and continue living as before. But further on came what finally destroyed everything, because he wrote that after this, it didn't become easier, that on the contrary, tension appeared that didn't go away, that they started avoiding conversations on this topic, but at the same time continued to cross paths, continued to communicate, and this tension only intensified. And at some point, according to his words, it became clear that forgetting wouldn't work, because what had happened had already changed everything. He admitted that he started thinking about this constantly, that it didn't leave his head, that he felt simultaneously guilt and some strange attachment that he couldn't explain, and this was written in such a way that it became clear. This didn't end at that moment when they agreed to forget. It was only beginning. I read this and understood that it was then that everything finally broke, because this was the moment when they could have stopped, when it was still possible to pretend that nothing had happened and truly end it. But they didn't do this, and everything that came after became a consequence of this one decision, this one evening, which for me was just a day of departure, but for them became the point after which there was no return. When I finished reading this part, I had neither anger left nor even shock, only emptiness, because now this wasn't just betrayal. It was a story that had a beginning, development, and consequences, and I understood that all this time I had been outside this story, though I thought I was at its center, and it was this feeling that knocked out of me everything that remained of hope, because it became clear that nothing I believed in was actually what I saw it as. I didn't immediately understand where exactly in this notebook the simple confession ends and something begins that changes everything, because up to this point, I had been reading as if someone else's story, painful, humiliating, but still limited to the fact of infidelity. And only when I flipped a few pages forward did I come across entries after which it was no longer possible to perceive this as a separate episode, because there was what happened after, and it was this that finally destroyed everything I had left inside. He wrote that after that night nothing ended, and even their attempt to pretend that nothing had happened only worsened the situation, because neither he nor she could forget, and tension began growing between them, which he at first tried to ignore, but over time it became too obvious to simply push aside. In these entries, he no longer tried to justify himself. There were no attempts to explain why this happened. There was only a description of how this began to destroy them from within. He wrote that she immediately took a position where she wanted to completely close this topic, forget, erase, not return to it, not discuss it, as if it had never happened at all, and that for her, this was the only way to preserve at least some stability. But he wrote that for him, this was impossible, that the feeling of guilt didn't just not go away, but became stronger, that he couldn't live calmly with this, that it kept returning to him constantly, in thoughts, in conversations, in any contact with her, and at some point he started trying to talk about this, raise the topic, look for some solution, but each time it ended the same way. She would close off, get irritated, avoid the conversation, and this gradually grew into conflict. I read this, and for the first time began to see not just the fact of infidelity, but the dynamic in which they existed. And this was worse, because it meant that all this time, they weren't just hiding this. They were living with it, discussing it, arguing about it, and I was part of their conversations, though I wasn't there. The hardest moment came further, when he described their meeting. He wrote that they agreed to see each other to finally decide what to do next. And this wasn't a random crossing of paths. It was a conscious decision, because the situation had reached a dead end, and they needed to either stop or accept the consequences. He wrote that they met in a park, and from the first lines it was clear that this wouldn't be a calm conversation. He described her state as tense and closed off. He wrote that from the very beginning she made it clear that she didn't want to return to this, that she considered this a mistake that needed to be forgotten, and that the main thing was that no one, especially me, should find out about it. He, on the contrary, wrote that he couldn't do this, that he was becoming physically ill from carrying this inside, that he felt how this was destroying him, and that he didn't see an exit where everything could be preserved as it was. And it was at this moment, according to his words, that the conversation began to get out of control. He described how she started pressuring him, saying that if he told anyone, this would destroy everything, that it would destroy me, destroy his relationship with my mother, destroy the whole family. And in these words, there was not only fear, but a harsh demand for silence. And he recorded this as a fact, without evaluation, but it was felt between the lines. Further, he wrote that at some point, the conversation stopped being a conversation and became a conflict where no one was trying to understand the other anymore, where there was only tension, fear, and the feeling that any decision would be wrong. And he wrote that it was then that he first felt that he wasn't coping not only morally, but physically. He described how his condition sharply deteriorated, how pressure appeared in his chest, how it became hard to breathe, how he couldn't concentrate, and how this feeling overwhelmed him right during this conversation. And he wrote this as if he himself didn't fully believe this was happening, as if his body simply couldn't withstand what he was holding inside. He wrote that the conversation ended abruptly, without any resolution, that they parted in a state where everything had only worsened, and after this he felt worse, that this condition didn't pass, but on the contrary, intensified, and at some point he understood that this was no longer just stress, and he had to seek help. And at this moment, something finally turned over inside me, because I remembered this period very clearly, because it was then that I was told he had been hospitalized, and I was in Europe then, and I remember how I asked what had happened, because he hadn't had any serious health problems before. And when I later spoke with him, he said it was because of work, that he simply had overload, a tense schedule, that he had overworked himself. And I believed him. I didn't ask extra questions, didn't doubt, because I didn't have a single reason to think that something else stood behind this. And now, reading this, I understood that at that moment, he was already in a state that this situation, this infidelity, this conflict had brought him to, and he still decided not to say anything. He chose to preserve this inside himself, even then, when it had already begun to destroy him physically. And at this moment, something finally changed inside me, because before this, I had perceived myself as a victim of circumstances, as a person who had been deceived. But here I saw the whole picture in its entirety, saw how all this developed, how decisions were made, how this led to the point where no one controlled the consequences anymore. And I understood that I could no longer look at this as something that simply happened to me, because this wasn't an accident. This was a chain of choices, and each of them led to what I'm holding in my hands now. After the hospital, he wrote about how hard it was for him to return to normal life, how each day after that seemed like a struggle for breath, for thoughts, for at least staying on the surface, and in these lines was felt that physical weakness was only the external manifestation of an internal catastrophe. He wrote that he always considered me his own son, that I was part of his life that he valued most of all, and simultaneously he admitted that he himself had destroyed this connection, himself had betrayed trust, himself had done what could never be forgiven. And from these words it became almost unbearably painful to read, because this was honest, without justifications, and in this was real guilt that pierced through him and through the records, me. He described the fear of losing my mother, the fear that if the truth came out, if someone found out, this would destroy her life, their family balance, and he tried to hold on, tried to find at least some way to survive all this. But each attempt failed, because she, my girlfriend, didn't just continue to exist in their shared secret, but looked for ways to pressure him so that the truth wouldn't come out, so that no one would find out anything. He wrote that every time she appeared nearby, with her words, with her hints, with her attempts to control. He felt his inner strength weakening, how his chest would tighten again, how he would turn away from the very thought that this situation continued. In these pages was the distinct pain of a person who understood. He had already destroyed trust. He had already betrayed. He had already done the impossible. And now he had to find the strength to live further, to keep himself within the limits he set for himself, but at the same time understand that each attempt was a step on thin ice. He wrote that he tried to hold on, tried to be near my mother, tried to preserve the appearance of ordinary life, but simultaneously inside him was the feeling that this lie lived in him, that it was like poison, with each day eating away at everything he valued. The last entry was made the day before his death. He wrote that he decided to tell me everything when I returned from Europe, that he didn't want me to learn from someone else, that he wanted the truth to reach me directly, honestly, though he understood that this would break me and possibly destroy forever what remained of our family. He wrote that she didn't even suspect this, that she still thought the situation was under control, that they could continue living in the old, false reality, and that this revolted him, that he could no longer reconcile with her attempts to impose her presence and decide what happened with our lives. He admitted that he wanted to end this, that he wanted to finally put an end to it, that he no longer had the strength to participate in her games, that each of her steps nearby was again pressure, again threat, again the feeling that he was responsible for everything that happened, and that on that last day, when he wrote this, he made an internal choice. He would no longer submit to her desires. He would be honest. He would stop allowing the situation to control him, even if this destroyed everything that remained. But otherwise, continuing was impossible. Reading these lines, I for the first time felt that I was seeing him real, that I understood his fear, his pain, his exhaustion, his human weakness, and simultaneously, strength. The strength to honestly admit everything and try at least somehow to correct the consequences, even if this was impossible. In this last entry was already felt a turn, the moment when he stops being a victim, when he makes a decision to act honestly, regardless of how destructive it would be for all of us. And it was this realization that finally overturned my perception. I understood that all this time inside was happening not only my pain, not only betrayal, but also his struggle. And now I for the first time saw the complete picture, which became my own burden. My new understanding of what betrayal, trust, and the necessity of making decisions mean, even if they break everything around. Now I sit by the window and see her. She walks down the street, laughs, talks on the phone, as if all this horror never existed, as if she controls everything, as if she has nothing to do with what destroyed my life and my family's life. And this feeling evokes in me simultaneously disgust and anger, because I see how well she can play, how easily she hides the truth, How confidently she builds the appearance that nothing happened, that she didn't deceive, didn't destroy, didn't betray. And this feeling of how skilled she is at this poisons everything inside. But at the same time, makes me soberly understand that now any emotional impulse will be superfluous. This isn't the moment to throw myself at her. This isn't the time for a reaction that I can control. I will be at the funeral. I will have to stand among people, listen to speeches, see tears, try to experience the loss that is already intertwined with betrayal, with pain, with humiliation, and simultaneously need to keep a straight face. Need to not let out that mixture of anger, emptiness, and bitterness that is now tearing me apart from within. And I know that while I'm there, I will be gathering strength, observing, trying to understand how to properly convey the truth, how to survive that moment when I will tell her everything, when I will bring out what was hidden for so long, when every word, every detail will destroy that illusion that she so carefully maintained. I know that after the funeral, everything will change. I won't be the same person. I won't be someone who trusted and believed. I will be someone who saw the whole truth, who knows how far lies can go, who understands that trust can be destroyed in one evening, by one mistake, by one chain of decisions. And I will need to act honestly, because otherwise I will never be able to move forward. I'm going to tell her everything, not for revenge, not to break her the same way she broke me, but to bring the truth to the surface, to tear apart the illusion she built, and give myself a chance to finally stop being part of this game, part of her control, part of the destruction. I will speak directly, openly, and I know that this will destroy much, but it will be honest. And in this is some form of strength, though it doesn't make the pain less. It doesn't make me happier. It simply allows me to finally stop living in a lie. And perhaps, when everything is said, I will be able to take a step further. Perhaps when the truth comes out, I will stop seeing her smile as a mask. I will stop seeing her lightness as deception. I will be free from this. But this freedom doesn't come without losses. And I know that the life I knew before I opened the notebook won't return. It disappeared along with trustfulness, along with illusion, along with who I was. Now I simply watch as she walks down the street and understand that this is the end of one story and the beginning of another, my own. I will go to the funeral. I will survive this. And then I will say everything. And after this, I will have to build life anew, with pain, with emptiness, but already without lies, without falseness, without her control. This is now my path, and I know that I no longer have a choice.